Okay. Hi everybody. Welcome to On Love and Money, a webinar with Bad Academy and Vancity. We're really excited to talk about this tonight. We feel like it's something that isn't talked about out loud very often, and it's something that all of us are thinking about. If you're dating or not dating, or currently in a relationship or not in a relationship, it's kind of just like important information to know. Um, Sort of like the inspiration came from trying to make sure that women are women and gender nonconforming people are prepared for kind of like anything that might come their way, and that we're focused on making sure that the individual as a person are supported. There is like a lot of, I don't know, focus in our society on couples and being in a relationship, and not really enough on what happens like before or after, and during, to make sure that yourself are protected, and that you feel comfortable with your current situation. So we're gonna kind of chat all things about love and money today, and we have an amazing panel of different perspectives. Um, so before we get started, I just want to, I'm just gonna stop this, sorry, the screen share. Um, okay. I just want to acknowledge that this broadcast is taking place on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations of the Coast Salish people. We are grateful to the Indigenous people who have cared for these lands long before any of us called it home, and we hold our hands up to their amazing resistance, resilience, and strength in the face of ongoing dispossession and colonial violence. Um, I also wanted to do a couple of housekeeping things. So we will be doing a Q&A at the end of this workshop. So if you do have questions throughout the workshop, what I'm going to ask you to do is pop them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So instead of putting them into the chat, put them into the Q&A so that we can make sure that we answer them eventually. If we do answer it throughout the workshop, then we'll kind of like remove it from the Q&A. But if you put it into the chat, there's a really good chance that it'll get lost. So just so you know. But we do want you to interact through the chat. So talk to each other, give us your reactions. Let us know if you have any insights into what we're talking about. We want to make this as interactive as possible. And if you get kicked off, you can just rejoin through the link that I sent you. I'll let you in. And if you need to leave, totally feel free. We will be sending you a recording. We had over 115 registrations for this workshop. So, and we have a fraction of that joining us live. But that means that, everybody is going to be watching this in the future. So hello, people in the future. Um, I also wanted to mention that we'll be sending out a resource list after this. So along with the recording, we'll also be sending out a list of resources that our lovely panelists have compiled, of things that they feel like are relevant and helpful for everybody. And if there's anything else that is mentioned during the workshop, I'll make sure to make note and send those to you as well. But feel free to take notes if you want. Um, okay. Here we go. So I'm just going to have our panelists introduce themselves. Louisa, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Luisa Ospina. I use she, they pronouns. I am the founder and the clinical director of Collective Healing, which is a counseling practice, an independent counseling practice here in so-called Vancouver. And we focus in supporting folks who experience trauma and oppression from a trauma-informed and intersectional feminist framework. We're also sex positive, and we provide services in person and online. And I'm very excited to be here today. I'm a registered clinical counselor, and I will be speaking on this topic from a perspective of mental health and wellness.
Thank you so much. Adriana?
Hi, my name is Adriana, and I am a wealth advisor at Vancity. I'm currently in Chilliwack, so I would just like to acknowledge that I am coming from the unceded territories of the Stolo Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past and present. So I started working in the investment industry in 2011, and I was working for a very traditional firm, so to say, lots of older white men, to put it bluntly, and my experience with investments and the capital markets at that point, I became a little disenchanted with what I was seeing, and I thought, you know what, this really isn't for me, and so I ended up going back to university, finishing my business degree, where I was really able to focus on sustainable business models and gender equity. Those are my passions, and I knew that I wanted to be. And that's actually where I learned that capital markets could be used for a force of good and for good things. And so that's how I ended up at Vancity, and it's been wonderful. I've been with Vancity as an advisor for the past 3.5 years.
Amazing. Thanks, Adriana. And last but not least, Leisha.
Hi, my name's Leisha Murphy, and I'm a family law lawyer with Connect Family Law. I started Connect Family Law about 10 years ago. We have offices in Vancouver, Surrey, and Kelowna. So I will be speaking from the point of view of, I guess, the law and what happens during breakups and any questions around how you can kind of streamline or potentially make breakups better in the future. Yeah, and I've been a family law lawyer for over 15 years now. So I've gone through breakups. I've dealt with over 15,000 hours of breakups. And my parents divorced when I was a kid. So I'm pretty well an expert, I would say, at this point.
If anyone's like, oh, I got it bad, it's like, Leisha's like, let me tell you,
Yeah,
1,500 hours of breakups.
15,000 hours, people.
Wow. Yeah. So you got some experience under your
That,
belt.
that's not including my personal stuff, too. So
I know, right? My goodness.
I've got more.
I got more. Okay, that's awesome. Uh, so as you can see, we have like an amazing panel of people that have kind of a different perspective on all things when it comes to love and falling out of love or whatever that might entail. I think we can all kind of agree that the logistics of breaking up or kind of coming together are never really like at the forefront of our minds, like when we're doing that. I think everyone's like, yeah, love makes you crazy. I think it just kind of takes the most focus, right? And so you're not thinking like logistically, like, how are we going to make this work? Or I think that's just not the first thing that we think about. So the way that we're going to structure this today is that we're going to kind of go through a list of questions with the panelists for the next, I don't know, like 45 minutes. And again, if you have any specific questions, please type them into the Q&A and let us know what you're thinking while we're talking in the chat function. So the way I'm going to kind of structure this is that we're going to first talk about being in love, which is more like what partnership kind of entails. And then the second part of this is going to be like, okay, well, like, what if I'm thinking about leaving my partnership, or what if I, am I in the process of it right now? What if like I've gone through it in the past and like I just like don't know how to handle it now that it's like we're in the kind of like really in the weeds of like the logistics of kind of separating at the moment. So we'll get into all of that. The first question is pretty simple, which is like, what are things to consider when you're thinking about entering a partnership with somebody when it comes to finances, but also from Louisa's standpoint, kind of like what should you be on the same page about when it comes to like um, combining kind of like the more like administrative or like logistical parts of a relationship. So who wants to go first? That's a kind of a big question. But what comes to mind first when you think about like, oh, what should you think about when you want to like combine your lives, basically?
I can go first.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think, first and foremost, it's so important that you are on the same page, that you have similar financial goals. I think communication is so key. Um, Being really clear on what your expectations are and what your boundaries are. Because, you might have the same goals, but expectations might be different. And also, what I see from couples who are combining their finances, it's very like it comes in all different shapes and sizes. There's not one size fits all for combining finances. So, it might look like the couple are coming together and they're creating one primary operating account, and that's where all of the incomes and expenses are coming out of. Or it might look like um, the couple is creating one joint account where their shared expenses are coming in and out of, and maybe there's a joint savings account for things like vacations, but then respectively they have their own personal savings account. So I think for just really important to have that discussion. What does it look like? Are you on the same page, and how do you want to move forward with this? Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Louisa, do you have any idea of like how you could have that conversation? Because it is like kind of awkward. Let's just be real.
Yeah, it definitely can be very awkward. I think that just to jump off with what Adriana was naming here, it's really important to consider kind of like what we're each bringing in into a relationship first. Like before we're even thinking about how we're going to talk to someone else about it, I feel like it's really important to understand what is like our own relationship with money. Like, what is your own personal relationship with it? Like, when we're thinking about money, we think about this thing that gives us access in the world and, purchasing power, but it's also a source of trauma for a lot of people. So when we're thinking about intergenerational trauma, or when we're thinking about even like what it's like to experience scarcity in childhood, for example, um, all of that shapes the way that we relate to money and finances, which then shapes our boundaries, it shapes our expectations, it shapes our spending habits, our beliefs around money, it shapes how we even envision our future and what part money takes in it. So the more that we understand our own relationship with money, the better equipped that we will be to actually have that conversation with our partners, because we know a little bit more, and that can change through time as well. It's not like stagnant. It's not like it's like what it's now is what it's going to be forever. But if we have, for example, a trauma with money, then we may get quite emotional or have really big responses of feeling unsafe whenever financial stressors might come in. And that's going to create a conflict with their partners if they don't know that about us, or they might feel like we're judging them or criticizing them when we're having those conversations. So I think that the first tool would be, what is your own? Do we understand how those experiences shape those beliefs? How does your relationship with money affect you emotionally and psychologically? And that will give you the tools to be able to be better able to have a conversation with your partner in the future when the time comes.
That makes a lot of sense. So like where are you coming from first, in order to like know where the other person could fit in, which I
Right.
love. Okay, let's ask the law what they think.
Oh, yes. So I guess what jumps to my mind is on the like polar opposite side of what Louisa just said. I'm thinking, okay, if you might want to think about if we move in together, we start cohabitating, when do we actually become spouses? Because until you become spouses, you don't have any legal rights, or obligations to one another. And by that, I mean like to financially support one another. If you separated, to divide property if you separated. And so in British Columbia, you are a spouse once you have lived in a marriage-like relationship for 2 years. So if you have a child together, you become spouses also, but in a more limited way. With respect to property division, obviously there's support that immediately occurs if there's a child. But if in terms of property division, you're looking at living together for a period of 2 years. I mean, you don't necessarily have to also live together. That's just one of the indicia. When the law says to live in a marriage-like relationship, you could have your own place or have your own places. But if you have a joint bank account or you hold yourself out to a community as in a committed relationship, if you're spending virtually all your time at one another's house, you could be considered a spouse. So actually living in the same residence together is just one factor that would be a deciding whether you're actually in a marriage-like relationship or not. It's like a number of these other factors as well. So I think people need to think about that when they move in together. Are they like accidentally falling into, that kind of committed relationship where there's actually financial ramifications if you separate? Now, if you separated before the 2 years, you don't, at least in the family law world, have much recourse for financial assistance from the other person. So I think one of the things we're going to talk about later is if you do find yourself in a committed marriage-like relationship, then should you consider what's called a cohabitation agreement, or colloquially called like a prenup, which is essentially a roadmap to how all this financial support and property division would go if you separate. And I'll just say quickly that, 10 years ago, it was like extremely uncommon to have a prenup done. I rarely did them in my practice, and I would say I'm doing 3 to 5 a week now. They're extremely common. I think people are just more savvy about the fact that breakups are potentially a reality, and let's decide how that's going to look, kind of along with what Louisa said, like, let's figure out our expectations around it now versus realizing our expectations are very misaligned if a breakup were to happen.
Wow, that's really interesting, Leisha. I guess like you can't really think about like joining finances and like joining a relationship with someone without also thinking about like what might happen if you were to like come apart. So like I guess like everything you're saying makes a lot of sense. Um, I guess like my just out of my curiosity, like when you're like saying like a marriage like relationship for like 2 years, like would someone have to like provide like testimony or something, like especially if you don't like live together?
Yeah, it comes down to the evidence. So if you got yourself into a court situation, and there was some debate about when the marriage like relationship started, that's when you would have to start disclosing through like oral testimony or any kind of, text messages or documents, or you would bring in other people that are in your community to kind of testify to what was happening at the time. So if you're not living together, it's more unlikely that you're going to be in a marriage-like relationship unless you're really spending a lot of time together and like very integrated from a financial point of view. Those are the main things that you're looking for, is that there's like financial integration. And, when you're out amongst your friends, like if you ask one of your friends, is this Amanda's partner or like casually dating? Like your friends are probably going to be able to pinpoint that very quickly. Right. So there's like a distinction in the way you carry yourself together, whether this is just someone like that you're kind of dating, not that serious with, versus like this is a potential life partner that you're very reliant and intertwined with. And that's really this distinction you're looking for. We're not looking for casually dating for 5 years, 10 years, right? Just because you've been together for 10 years doesn't mean you're in a marriage-like relationship. It's that like next level of commitment.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Leisha. Which kind of brings me to like my next ask, which is like, what is the advantages and disadvantages. Like we talk more about advantages now, if that makes more sense for everybody, of combining your finances with a partner. I think like we've heard a lot like about like tax breaks and like maybe like Louisa can talk about like the cohesiveness or something about something like that, or support when it comes to finances being combined. And then maybe from a law perspective, if there's like an advantage to actually being in like a uh like a legal like partnership where you are combining your finances, because from what I'm hearing from you, Alicia, is that like if you're combining your finances, but you're not like married, you're still kind of like in the eyes of the law like in a very like legal partnership. So maybe Adriana, you can kind of kick us off here.
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of advantages, there can be a lot of advantages to combining your finances. When you are coming together with another person, then you are essentially doubling your resources to achieve your goals, and in theory, achieving your goals at a faster pace. Um, on top of which, yes, there are definitely some, and I'm not an accountant. I don't provide tax advice. I know my manager's on this call. So if you're looking for tax advice, consult an accountant. But there can be tax advantages through deductions, credits, income splitting in retirement. And then on top of which, it can be really nice to have that accountability. When you are sitting down, you are working towards a shared goal, and you have someone to 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 hold you accountable. I know personally, my husband and I, like, we have a joint credit card, and we do regularly, we review the statements, and it can be, some months it's like, yeah, like we did great, and others it's like, oh man, like I'm gonna have to justify that Aritzia purchase. But and to that end, it can provide a level of intimacy and closeness as well when you're working together. On the flip side, um, if I think it best case scenario, if you're not aligned, then frustration at best and potential financial ruin on the very flip side of that. Like, that's very dramatic, but you can expose yourself. I know I work with one family, and husband and wife, they're in their 30s, they've got two kids, they've got their retirement savings plan, their TFSAs, um, RESPs for the kids. Everything is going really, really well. And then about a year ago, I got a call from the wife, and she started asking me about how can she start taking money out of her investments, or what would it look like to take out a second mortgage. And it really wasn't making sense to me. So, after a conversation, it turns out that her husband, who is self-employed, sole proprietorship, had actually incurred tens of thousands of dollars of debt in his business account. And she had no idea about that, what was going on. And there's so many layers of how upsetting that is. Number one, that's, she's just found out that her family's in debt and she had no idea. And then on top of which, her partner has been keeping this from her. So there's that whole emotional layer as well. And, I'm sure Louisa and Alicia can speak to that as well.
Oh no, that sounds so bad. Yeah, Louisa, like maybe you can weigh in on on sort of the emotional or partnership piece when it comes to like combining finances, like and how it could be beneficial.
Yeah, of course. So it can be really reassuring, and I really appreciated Adriana's kind of framing here around accountability, right? Because it's kind of like having like a buddy or like buddies to like support you in kind of reaching specific goals, right? So there can be this kind of reassurance of I feel accompanied, and I have somebody that I can like throw these ideas off of, and like and share, right? It helps with like that collective visioning aspect, and there's also the reassurance of knowing that there's someone else who kind of like also keeping an eye on things in case that something goes wrong, right? Like it's that reassurance of having that support too that meets those emotional needs. And that can be quite an advantage. Um, the pieces that come up around that that could be disadvantages is I think it's again really aligned with what Adriana was sharing about that those clients is that doing this, money is power, right? Like it gives us a lot of ability to take care of ourselves, to take care of our community, of our loved ones. It brings stability. Um, and sometimes it requires quite a bit of trust to be able to combine your finances with another person, right? So it requires trust, and trust is something that is ongoing. It's something that we cultivate. It's something that requires collaboration in the relationship, right? And unfortunately, things like trauma or fear or other emotions can get in the way of that trust and that communication, which seems to be maybe what had happened, might have happened with these folks that Adrienne is talking about, right? Something was not communicated, and now that trust has been breached, right? And the stability of the entire family is at stake. So that can be quite a big disadvantage, right? Now, this client is now feeling maybe the responsibility of bringing their family back afloat in a moment of hardship, right? And it can be really hard when your partner did that without telling you, right? You're not in it together anymore. Right. So it's almost a way in which we're giving up power and we're gaining power at the same time, depending on how finances are structured in the relationship.
Yeah. I mean, like, I think like some people have like a notion that if you were to combine with somebody else, you're giving up like half of your power technically because like it's like you're sharing your life with somebody. But I like the idea of it actually like being like supportive for both people to be able to like work together on something that is generally very like isolating. Like finance in general. I mean, we don't even talk to our closest friends about finance a lot of the time. So it's kind of nice to have that closeness with somebody and that intimacy, even though like I would never equate a finance with intimacy. But it is actually a thing.
Advisor.
Adrian was like, I disagree. Alicia, do you have any thoughts about this? Like the advantages, maybe from a law perspective, of combining, but then also maybe we can move a little bit more into the disadvantages, since we're gonna talk about that soon anyway, and I feel like you probably have something to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that everyone has said. I would say that it is very common, even in a relationship, for people not to really understand the family finances. I've had it on both extremes. I've had one situation where the wife she was my client, and the husband had amassed a whole bunch of commercial properties and they were extremely wealthy, and she had no idea. Basically just like lived a pretty average lifestyle. And it wasn't until they separated and all of this had to be disclosed that she realized that there was like a lot of wealth. Like I'm talking in the tens of millions of dollars. And so I've had that extreme. And then I've had the other extreme where kind of similar to the story about the couple is one person is just kind of, as they say, taking from Peter to pay Paul, or however that goes, and juggling lines of credit. And the other spouse thinks that they're maintaining a certain level of a lifestyle that actually is not sustainable without a lot of debt and like a very stressful existence. And so when they separate, there's misaligned expectations because the one spouse who wasn't aware of all the debt and the movement of credit cards and lines of credit thinks, oh, well, we've always had this money, so my expectation is that my support or what my life is going to look like is going to continue. And the other spouse is like, well, it's not possible for it to continue like that. If we're living in separate households, we were barely making it by while we were combined. And so then you have difficulty there. So, I mean, I would just say that if you are going to combine finances, which I agree can be very beneficial in terms of pooling resources together, and being able to maybe afford to like rent a nicer place, or to be purchasing one set of furniture and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, be open and transparent, and go see a financial advisor to create joint goals of like what you want, what you both are working towards, how that's going to look. Very clear expectations on, is one person going to take care of the kids and stop working? And what does that mean in the long run? Because that means that person has taken themselves out of the workforce, and that's going to have an impact on their career trajectory. So I think there's lots of benefits, but I think it should not be taken lightly, and assumptions should not be made about what what the family finances are going to look like. I think you need to have those hard conversations. And then the disadvantages are the main disadvantage I see in the long run is that if somebody does take themselves out of the workforce to support the other spouse or to support their family or something along those lines, if it's for an extended period of time, it can be really hard to go back into the workforce. One, from a confidence point of view, I don't think people realize that if you've been out of the workforce, it can impact your self-confidence, whether your skills are up to date. And then you may be relying on support from a spouse that is not very interested in you anymore, and it does not want to support you financially. And that can be tough going, because you have to negotiate with that spouse or try to extract some kind of financial support for them. And that's a bit demoralizing if the person doesn't want to pay you. And then you're also trying to figure out, how do I get myself back into the workforce? So I think if you become financially reliant on somebody else, it makes sense when you're together, because you're kind of specializing your roles. One person's the income earner, the other person's taking care of the house. And from an economics theory point of view, specialization is the most efficient. But from a personal point of view, if you're the one who's taking themselves out of the workforce for an extended period of time, it can have real ramifications. So a bunch of my friends, we all have children that are, in the kind of 4 to 10-year-old range. And all of my girlfriends, I'm like, just be a contractor, just do something. Just I have a friend of mine working for me. I'm like, just do something to stay in it, even if it's not full time, even if it's not for someone else. If you can do something, just to feel like you have that ability to ramp up quickly if you needed to. So yeah.
That's a really good tip, Leisha. I don't think a lot of people think about that, because again, it's an emotional thing. It's a confidence thing. I don't think a lot of people put a lot of weight on how you might feel. It's always you're always just kind of in survival mode, oh, how am I going to pay for all this?
Yeah.
But it's also part of it is are you going to have the chutzpah to be able to be able to kind of get back on the horse. This kind of what you said, Leisha, kind of reminded me that it's difficult to have these conversations in the first place. I would love to hear Louisa's perspective on how to have these conversations with somebody. Say you're I don't know, almost a year in with somebody, and you're okay, well, I'm considering this is a long-term partnership, whatever. A lot of times from my perspective, I used to work in HR, feedback or tough conversations don't happen because people are worried about the reaction that the other person's going to have when you kind of bring up these subjects. Money is such a sort of intense subject that a lot of people don't want to talk about in the first place. And then there's all these really interesting connotations from our society and culture where women are characterized as gold diggers, or or maybe stingy, or something if you're more wealthy. I'd be interested to hear if you have any tools that people can use when it comes to having these tough conversations, and to not be as afraid to talk to their partners about it.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you're bringing that up, because it is difficult to talk about money. It's uncomfortable. And part of this process is, again, I always start with the self, is what is getting in the way of you having this conversation with your partner if it's something that you find important to discuss, right? I know that sometimes we think about, oh, how can I protect myself from this? How I protect myself from that? But sometimes we wait until the thing is happening to address it, and it's better to think about it as like preemptively, or to try to do it ahead of time. So when we're thinking about what might be getting in the way, it might be discomfort, it might be fear of getting judged or being abandoned, or maybe they'll think that I'm being too intense. Like whatever that might be, it's important to sit with that, connect with those emotions, and explore where that comes from and how to regulate yourself through that, because it shouldn't stop you from being able to engage in the conversations that you need to have to feel secure in your relationship, and to identify your collective values, and where your visions or expectations for the relationship or cohabitation or the future align, and where they misalign, because you might be better able to prepare yourself once you know where that misalignment is, right? So it creates also trust to be able to build those conversations, right? If you cannot speak to your partner about something as like money, or even like your future plans together, what does that say about the viability of this relationship long term, right? Like it's really important to start noticing, is this the person that I feel comfortable having these conversations with? Because there will be many of them if you stay with that person long term, right? So it's really important to start building your resilience to have those difficult conversations. And it starts with managing our own emotions, or even exploring. It can be with yourself through like journaling, it could be with friends, it could be with therapists, it could be in a lot of different um, pockets. What's getting in the way? What are my fears? How reasonable is that? Does it really align with who I know my partner to be? Is my partner a lot more emotionally attuned than I'm giving them credit for at this time? To kind of really allow yourself to sink into that and increase that comfort level and confidence in being able to have those conversations. And really centering vulnerability, inviting your partner to have a conversation. Hey, I want to have a conversation that's a little bit awkward or a little bit sticky. It has to do with money. It has to do with our future. I know we've been thinking about moving in together. And this is something that I've been thinking about. Are you open to talking to me about that? It can really, really develop the trust when you're inviting someone and being vulnerable with them about what your concerns are guided by in terms of your emotions. And it really invites them to also do the same. So that creates that space to really collaborate together, and then creates more trust and security in the relationship, because there's more groundedness on where we align and where we don't align.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense. Like I think my experience as a woman, and from what I've heard from my own community, is that like because like women have been sort of like isolated from finance in general for so long, like historically. um Adriana, maybe you can tell me like what was the like women couldn't have credit cards until what year without a male co-signer?
So, Vancity was actually the first financial institution in Canada to give a woman a loan without a male cosigner. And that was in 1961, which is
That was like yesterday.
but it was Vancity. It was Vancity.
I mean, that's very cool. But the not cool was the fact that yeah, women weren't allowed to have loans. So anyway, as like a systemically, women have been at a disadvantage when it comes to finances and money for a long time. When it comes to literacy, like financial literacy or financial access. Um, so it can be very jarring to want to bring up this subject because you're like, I already feel like a fish out of water, and then here I am bringing this up with someone else who maybe has more experience with it, or might have different opinions about it. It can be very scary. So I think just know that it can be very triggering to kind of have these conversations, and that you're not like alone in that. So anyway, thank you so much, Louisa. And Adriana, you want to say something?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I was just thinking, in terms of having these conversations and asking these questions, I find that they can be a bit easier when you're not so emotionally like a year is a long time to have been in a relationship with someone and having not had these conversations. And it can almost be like the longer that these conversations don't happen, then the longer that they go on not happening. And so I would really invite anyone who is in the dating world to have these questions, you know, when you're getting to know someone, you know, when it authentically feels right. I know that that can be really challenging because within society, you know, if we start asking questions, you know, like, how do you feel about like the next 5 years? Like, what are your goals and having a family? And, you know, sometimes it can be like, you're coming on too strong or you're crazy. But you know what? Like, we we know what we want and we deserve it and we're not going to settle. And I think it really can be a lot easier if you do have those questions, those conversations sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I agree. We don't have time for this shit is kind of how I would want to put it.
Amen.
We got a lot of questions kind of like piling up, but everyone, I am checking in on those. I think a lot of them will be answered very soon. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about all the time is like the power dynamics that happen with money. So, um, I think from a woman's perspective, it can be pretty tough to either have more power, and then even and also very tough to have less power, obviously. Different reasons for both. And as we all know, money is power in our society currently. So I guess like I would love to hear from our panelists about power dynamics when it comes to money. What if you make more than your partner? How do you protect yourself if that's the case? What if you make less? And sort of like when I mean like power dynamics, I mean like how do you also harness that sort of like power that you have, if it is more or less? I don't know if Alicia, if you wanted to weigh in. You also, I can give you a second. I feel like there's like a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, it's always difficult when there's a significant income disparity, no matter which way it's going. I think that always creates an issue. And like Louisa said, like money is power in a lot of circumstances. And that kind of goes back to my point earlier about I mean, the main way we make money is by working in the workforce, or, you know, whether we're self-employed or working as an employee. And so maintaining some link or some ability to earn your own money, I think really helps level that playing field over time so that you're not completely dependent on somebody else, or at least you know you could go back and make money if you needed to. I think that that helps equalize some of that power imbalance if you know that if you needed to take care of yourself, you could. And that's often really difficult, especially for women, because biologically, unless you're adopting, but biologically, if you're having your own children, we have them. And so there's that element of, you know, it takes a lot of time to be pregnant, have the child, and then, you know, the first few years. And then, of course, a lot of women want to be home with their children and be available to them because they're only around for like in terms of the caring for them for a short period of time in the scheme of your life. And that's totally understandable. And like, that's a very respectable and difficult pursuit, to stay at home with children. And some mothers are homeschooling their kids too. On the flip side of that, though, is if you don't have a link to making any income in the future, then I think that can create some discord in the relationship unless you really have those open and transparent conversations and maybe have some kind of timeline or game plan. Because what I see is there's an original game plan for like say this is like in a more like, I guess, typical like heterosexual relationship, but often even in like in a non-heterosexual relationship, you have one person who's more drawn to be the caregiver. So they are drawn to that role. And then after the kids kind of start aging out and they're more independent, that person has lost that, verve or that ability to reconnect with an ability to earn income. And so it just kind of goes on, and there isn't really necessarily as much of a need for them to be at home in the same way there was when the children were young, but they've just kind of lost the thread on that part of their identity. And so there's that piece of things. If you are the higher income earner or you're bringing in, you got a gift or inheritance. So I see that a lot. People have gifts or inheritances from family members or whatever happens in their life. I think it's absolutely fine to get some kind of agreement that protects that property. Because what I say to people is, especially if it came from your parents, or if you've had someone pass away in your life that left you property, you don't want that property or wealth accidentally diverting to another family, essentially, right? Because let's say you don't protect that inheritance, and it's the increase in value of the inheritance or gift that's family property, not the actual inheritance itself. So if it gains a lot of value, let's say, for example, it was a condo that you inherited from your aunt and it gained a lot of value in the market, and then you separate and you owe your spouse half of that increase in value, you might have to sell the condo. And if you're young enough, your spouse goes off with their half of your increase in value and like remarries and has a whole other set of children. And all of a sudden that gift from your aunt has diverted into some family that you don't even know. And your aunt could have worked very hard to make that condo happen, right? Or be able to purchase that condo. And you've like accidentally kind of diverted it somewhere else. So I see that a lot. People are like floored when I say that, well, no, the increase in value is on the table. And they're like, well, how can that be? This is a gift from my aunt. This is mine. They didn't do anything to help me with the property. I rented it out. I did all the renos. I did everything. And I'm like, well, the law doesn't care that you did that. And so if you're the higher income earner, then you need to protect yourself. And if you're the lower income earner, you need to think of like, okay, if I get in a tough spot here, or even like, what if my spouse becomes disabled? Or what if my spouse passes away and they don't have any life insurance or anything? Like, how am I going to deal with that?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot to think about. Thank you, Alicia. Adriana?
Yeah, so much good stuff there. And I just really want to echo the importance of insurance. It really is, especially in both cases, if you are the higher income earner or if you were the lower income earner, if one of, if the person who's making the most money, whom the household is really relying upon, if they lose their ability to provide that income, in some cases where if there's not an emergency fund or proper insurances in place, then I mean margins can be really sheer, and that can put you in a really precarious situation, and things you wouldn't even expect. Like I was in a really bad car accident earlier this summer. Never would have in a million years would have seen that coming, and I was out of work for months. But thankfully, I had my short-term disability, and that really was hugely impactful. On top of which, you really, regardless of higher or lower income earner, you do want to make sure that you have financial independence. And if you don't, as Lisa was mentioning, like working towards that, because that really, you never want to be in a position where you can't step away, or if the relationship ends, that you're not in a position to be able to support yourself. Generally speaking, a good rule of thumb for emergency funds is 3 to 6 months worth of your fixed costs. So kind of building up towards that. And then on top of which, really, trying to educate yourself, working with a financial advisor this is really, this is why we're here, is to help you. I think a lot of people might not understand that these services that we offer, um, they're at no extra cost to you. We offer these services to our members to help you to provide that financial literacy and education. So yeah, financial literacy is really key.
Thank you. Louisa, if you could maybe weigh in on I guess like the power dynamic is probably more like what you would uh be able to sort of weigh in on when it comes to inequity in wealth in relationships.
Yeah, so I think what's really important to consider around this is, and we briefly touched on it earlier, is if you're the higher earning partner, for example, is um, what are the collective values in this relationship, and what are the expectations surrounding finances in this relationship? Is one of the first things that comes to mind, because essentially what will happen is that if you're agreeing to something that doesn't really align with your values and your expectations, or feels like it's outside of your own boundaries, what's going to happen over time is that you're going to develop resentment towards your other partner. And that can happen with a lower earning income partner as well, especially because oftentimes the folks that end up as lower earning income partners, they're usually taking up other responsibilities in the household, other roles, roles that are oftentimes not financially paid, but that are incredibly laborious and important for the well-being and the management of the household. So that can also lead to a lot of resentment if it feels like that is not being valued in the same way as earning money is, right? So what's really important is to understand what are the collective values, and how do we value those pieces together, and how is that part of how we see money within the relationship, right? Because that labor is not being paid for externally, that labor is happening in house, right? But it's still labor anyway, right? So we're thinking about those power dynamics in terms of like, who is valued more? How is finances part of this? How is other parts of labor part of this? And how are we setting this up so that there is a common understanding of what this is, to prevent that resentment and those like emotions from harboring against each other, right? We're a team ultimately in a relationship, and it's really important to determine what that looks like. So part of protecting ourselves, I think, in either role is what is our common understanding of these things, and how do we value each other through that, and how are we navigating that in a way that feels aligned with us individually, but also as a collective.
Right, right. So being on the same page, essentially, about everything. Yeah, I mean that I think that makes so much more sense than kind of like I don't know, like starting with like, oh, let's like open up our bank accounts to each other and just like go poking through, which I don't think anyone actually does. I don't know, maybe. But talking about like collective goals or sort of like what we're working towards together is potentially a good way to understand like who plays what role, and what does everybody bring to the table. Which kind of brings me to my next question about strategies and around uh working with a partner when it comes to like planning for finances. So strategies meaning like I think we've talked about how to have these tough conversations, but also like maybe talking about like ways that you can kind of sustain it. I think a lot of times in like long-term relationships, you can like let things fall by the wayside. You kind of get wrapped up in like the day-to-day life, or you're always like, I'm just like going to work every day, taking care of the kids, like this is just part of it. But then you're kind of like neglecting having some of these really important conversations, making sure that your values are still aligned, making sure that you're still working towards the same thing, or that the power dynamic hasn't changed or shifted in some way. So I guess like I would love to hear from our panelists about strategies around um, sort of like your financial journey as a couple together, and how you can kind of make sure that there's longevity in it. Who wants to go first?
I can go first. Um, what comes to mind for me is how are we um, taking care of the emotional connection in the relationship? Because the emotional connection in the relationship is what sets the tone for difficult conversations or even just conversations in general to be able to be fruitful and collaborative and for us to hear each other, right? So there's in the resources there's a book by Sue Johnson, who's a couples therapist who does emotionally focused therapy. And she really suggests having these kind of regular emotional check-ins with your partner. It's kind of in other therapies called kind of like what is the state of the union check-in of so it's just kind of like meeting with your partner regularly. That can be weekly, every few months, just to kind of check in and be like, hey, how are we doing? How are we feeling? With all the labor that you're doing at work or the work that I'm doing here, how connected are we? Um, and that can really set the tone of we're still in this together. We trust each other. It can increase the security in the relationship, and it can really again amp up that collaboration so that those conversations around finances or stressors are not separating you but are uniting you. You're in it against the problem. The problem is the stressor, is not each other, right? So being able to do that can really kind of nourish the relationship. So having those emotional connective moments is really important, and that allows kind of naturally to have those other conversations like finances or future planning kind of come up more organically rather than it having to be like, oh, there's this big thing happening, we need to tackle it, right? Like it can be more general but like a general practice in the relationship. um, the other thing that comes to mind is really starting to pay attention to the negative cycles in the relationship. Start noticing how you show up in the face of conflict. Do you avoid conflict? Do you prevent yourself from talking about conflict? Are you very conflict forward? Do you get really you're really familiar with conflict and then get really like excited and like very like emotional in ways that take up a lot of space that can maybe hinder your partner from being able to engage with you in the conflict. So it's really really about kind of noticing how do I engage and how do I support my partner engaging with me as well. Because then we fall into this pattern in which one person is retreating and the other person is pursuing. So then it ends up being kind of like a tug of war, and no one is being able to connect or really understand each other in that conversation. So the more that we are able to pick up how do I contribute to this negative cycle, we prevent from that self perpetuation of that cycle to continue. So it might look like being able to um, not be defensive when something difficult is being brought forward, is being able to empathize and try to hear your partner, even if your perspectives about money and spending are completely different, even if you're really see that the way that your partner is overspending is actually one of the root issues in the dynamic of the stressor, right? Like whatever it might be, we can still make space for our partner and like really attune to them and be like, hey, I hear you. I'm really worried about that. Can we look into our spending habits to see how each one of us contributes to this? That really creates that space of like, I'm here with you rather than this is all on you, right? It becomes like a conflict, it becomes a blaming game. Again, it takes you away from that collaboration of we're a team against the stressor, and instead we're fighting against each other because of the stress, right? So those are some key things that come to mind right off the bat.
That's amazing, Luisa. I feel like if anyone wasn't convinced to go to see a couples counselor, they're definitely convinced now. Like this is so good, such great information. I have I think I've heard the term money date be used, which is that like every like few months or whatever, you have a money date with your partner and you go to like a nice restaurant or you go somewhere that's like less stressful and kind of like have treats available where you're having like kind of a typically more stressful conversation like in a better setting. And that's like a strategy that you could try as well, so you can kind of make it a little bit fun to be having these conversations. Leisha, do you have anything to say about this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from a legal point of view, if you did have some kind of cohabitation agreement or You can even do an agreement if you're already married. You can do a marriage agreement. Like you can do an agreement whether you're not living together. I've done agreements where it's like a relationship agreement. I've done ones where people are living together, they're married, they've been married for 20 years. Like you can get an agreement done at any time. So, but what I would say is if you do have an agreement done, you just like your estate planning, like a will, you need to revisit it. Just kind of what you and Louisa were saying, like, does the agreement still make sense for where the relationship's at? Like maybe you did the agreement before you had kids and now you have kids, and do you need to account for that? Maybe you guys, bought a house together or something major has happened. So you need to continually come back to any like legal documents at least and make sure that they're tracking with where your life is at. I think that's pretty much it on the legal side of things. I guess the only thing I would say is if you don't have an agreement and you get a large inheritance or something significant happens, maybe consider getting an agreement at that point. So yeah, pretty much when significant events occur, just think about, do I need something in place, kind of a rainy day piece, just like insurance. That's really what these agreements are, is they're insurance to give you some certainty if the unplanned event happens, that you've got a game plan.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I think we have like some questions about like when you should sign these agreements, or like, when is it appropriate? But what you said is like, it doesn't matter. Just like do it when you're ready, I guess.
Yeah, do it when you're ready. The one thing I will say is if you have been living together for 1 year and 10 months, it can be difficult to get the agreement all wrapped up within 2 months, or, like 2 days before you're getting married. Maybe not the best, because what we don't want to have happen is if it's 2 days before you're getting married, and you say to the other person, like, sign this or I can't marry you, then you have something called duress, where basically the person feels like, I better sign this because I want this wedding to happen. And then later on, they can say, like, I was under so much pressure to sign that I didn't really appreciate the risks of signing, or I felt like there was no alternative, so I signed. And then that's actually a way to challenge the validity of the agreement. So you want to make sure that you're leaving yourself enough time to like properly consider the terms, go see a lawyer, get some advice, and like think about it, and that you're not putting so much pressure on this person. Although I have had a situation where people actually went through the process of talking about an agreement and they broke up because they realized that they were like not on the same page. Or I had one person that was like, okay, if I hit the 2 year mark, I'm just going to move out. So, that can happen. But ideally you would start talking about it before the marriage or the 2 year mark. But yeah, there's no real good time to talk about it. And if you do go ahead and get a cohabitation agreement, really talk about it between the two of you, because earlier on in my career, I assumed people were talking about the agreement, and then all of a sudden, the other person would take the agreement to a lawyer and hear all this stuff, and there'd be like a lot of upset about what had happened. And it's not a separation agreement, it's a marriage agreement, so we're trying to keep it friendly. So it would be better if you talk about it and like what you guys jointly would like to see in the agreement, rather than one person just running off, getting the agreement done, and then kind of surprising the other person when they actually go through it with a lawyer and understand what the terms mean. So, and I know lawyers are really expensive and nobody likes to pay the legal bills, including myself. I wouldn't even want to pay for myself because I know that, it sucks, but there's a lot of words in cohabitation agreements, like if you pull one off the internet, that have meaning that's actually rooted in our case law and have a deeper meaning than the normal English language understanding of that word, or certain clauses have a specific reason they're there. And if you don't do these things all the time, which hopefully you're not, you may not understand that. So even for me, if I'm doing like if I'm doing a shareholder or partnership agreement, because I have partners, I go get independent legal advice on that from a corporate lawyer, even though I'm a lawyer, just because there's certain wording in a commercial document that wouldn't be the same in a family law document. And it's just really important that you understand what you're signing and educate yourself. Even if you just go for, 30 minutes or an hour of advice, it's insurance for you, right? Like it might seem like a significant cost, but you could be really giving up a lot more money than like a couple $100. So that's my plug for years. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. It can be like a hard pill to swallow to be paying for that, but at the same time, like you're saying that like in the long run, that's gonna really protect you. That's smart.
Yeah.
Also second that.
Yeah.
My mom's a family lawyer, and when I met my husband, he was still going through a divorce with his ex-wife, and right off the bat, my mom was just like, "Don't mess around, just get a lawyer." Both parties didn't want to pay. They wanted to go the more cost-effective economic route, the DIY divorce. Absolute disaster. And one of the big part of law, of finance, of these different fields is the educational piece. Like I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the nuances of the law, and that's a big reason why we do exist, is to help you for that very reason. So yes, there are costs associated, and sometimes they suck. Like we've seen the legal bills, and I just I wish it had happened sooner. So yeah, definitely worth it. And then sorry, go ahead, Amanda.
No, I was just gonna say, like, do you any of you have resources around like potential like legal advice that you can receive that's not super, super costly? Like, are there like law students or anything like that, Leisha, that you could offer to people that are really like low income or don't have those resources?
Yeah, there's Rise Women's Legal Center. I don't think I gave you that one, Amanda, as a resource, but yeah, Rise, they are specifically catered to women and low income. They're students, I believe, from UBC overseen by lawyers. There's this, what is it called? I think it's lawyer referral service, something like that. And they give, they're lawyers who give 30 minutes of advice for $25. Lawyer referral service. Yeah. Legal aid is very tricky because it's very limited, and you have to qualify not only on an income level, but on an issue level. And because it's so limited, most of our legal aid actually goes to criminal matters or family violence matters. There's a whole other talk on basically how a lot of our legal aid goes to men because statistically more men are criminals. So, and most of our legal aid goes to crime, like criminal matters, because of course that's like not life-threatening in the sense we have the death sentence, but if you're going to jail, that's pretty intense. And so they want to make sure that people get proper representation, but it is a problem, which is what Rise Women's Legal was trying to balance, was the lack of legal aid for women's issues, because not everyone has like a family violence issue that would rise to the level of legal aid. So that's not a very accessible resource. But yeah, the lawyer referral service, Rise, and I mean, like at Connect, we have something called Connect Community, and basically it's like much lower flat fees for lower income folks. And there's anyways, there's other law firms I know in town. If people want to know of those resources, people can email me, and because it's kind of specific of what they're looking for. So I kind of know who's doing what in the city, but they can email me.
Okay, that's a generous offer. Thanks, Leisha. I'll include those resources in the little wrap up that I'm sending everybody, just so everyone knows. Okay, so I want to make sure that we have enough time to answer some of our questions here. Um, we're going to move on to the out of love section of this panel. We've talked a bit about it. There's just really no way to not talk about it at the same time that we're talking about being in love. Um, I guess like we sort of marketed this workshop with like the title of like what is the actual cost of a breakup. Um, I am sorry to say that it depends. And that is the answer that you will get from most people. Um, but I guess like I would love to have like more of a conversation around what it does cost, because I think that a lot of times people might get married and they're like, well, you could just get divorced. Or, if we just break up, I'm just gonna leave. I don't think that that is obviously necessarily the case for a lot of different people, and we don't really put a lot, if I'm in my opinion, enough weight on how detrimental it could be towards your finances or your life in general. So I guess like I'd love to ask our panelists about the costs associated with breaking up, whether that's divorce or separation or just breaking up. Maybe Adriana, you can kind of kick us off here.
Yeah, for sure. So like you said, 100%, every case is totally different and it really depends. There are so many variables at play in a breakup, and we've got, tangible costs. You're likely right off the bat just having your net worth with through the division of assets. Um, Leisha made a really great point earlier about, generally speaking, for example, if you are the lower income earner, and through the division of properties, things like RSPs and pensions, they'll be divided. But from an intangible aspect, if you have been the caretaker, if you've been looking after young children, if you've been caretaking an elderly parent, then that's time away from the workforce, time that you haven't been earning an income. And again, maybe your skills aren't at what's currently the expectation. So those are all things to consider. The emotional aspect as well, as well as potential tax consequences. You know, retirement goals are changing. Before there may have been, if you were a dual income earning house and you're both contributing to your financial goals, now it's on you again. I believe, when you do separate, there is a potential that you may be entitled to CPP benefits with your partner while you were together. That's also a factor. But yeah, and then just the emotional and anxiety cost as well. Like it's quite deep.
Yeah, that's very true. Adriana, can you speak to like how like debt is handled in separations? Like if you have any idea around that. I think like some people say that like, oh, you would like if you were like married to somebody, you would like essentially take on their debt, or vice versa. And like we will be everyone, just so you know, like we will be doing a workshop on debt very soon, in general, because there is like good and bad debt. But maybe you can speak a little bit to that and like assets and stuff.
Yeah, so I think this is where Alicia's also gonna be a really important person to speak to, because when, if you are in that partnership, that legal partnership, common law or married, then depending on how diligent you've been in terms of separating assets, then, if they're combined, if they're joint, then you'll likely go through, I'm saying likely, I'm trying to speak in general terms because this is, I think the legal part of it, going through that division of assets and going through the net. Leisha, help me out here. Because you're gonna divide the assets and then just on who owns what and how it's been divided. And then that will really depend on how that debt is treated in the separation.
You did a good job. I can just jump in quickly from a legal standpoint. Basically, any debt that accumulated during the relationship is considered family debt, no matter how it was accumulated. And then once you separate, any debt that you accumulate on your own for your own personal spending is your own debt. And if there's any debt after separation that was needed or used to sustain a family asset, like, so for example, a mortgage or a line of credit that was used for children's expenses or something of that nature, that would continue to be family debt. You can make an argument that, let's say you had one spouse who had a gambling problem during the relationship and racked up a lot of gambling debt, and the other spouse didn't know about the gambling debt. You could make an argument that they shouldn't have to share in the debt, but that's an argument you have to make. It's not the starting place for how the legislation looks at family debt. So you do really want to have those conversations because in Adriana's earlier story about the couple, the business going bad and all of that debt, like, she's on the hook for that. So there's really no way to get around that. And if you basically, creditors can kind of go after both spouses until, if you separate, then you sort of become your own person and you have your own protections from creditors and that type of thing. But while you're together, the way the law sees it is you've decided to be with this person, so in for a penny, in for a pound. You're there.
I see. I think like also something to consider maybe on a less severe standpoint is like the cost of moving. Like we live in a very expensive city. Uh, I think like sometimes when you're moving in with someone, you're like, throw out the kettle, like throw out the whatever, because like we don't need two of everything. Which like I'm not saying like everyone should be pack rats and like keep their own shit. But I'm just saying like there's something to consider when it comes to moving. And also like in an emergency situation where you need to vacate quickly. Like what is that? It's going to cost something, right? The cost of moving is not cheap. And then also like setting up your new life and kind of like allowing for time to set up a new life. These are all things that need to be considered when it comes to the cost of breaking up. And then now we're going to ask Louisa about like the emotional cost of breaking up.
Great. Yeah, breaking up is hard. I think we all know this, right? I feel like when we're thinking about the actual cost of a breakup, the conditions of the breakup are really a big part of that. Is very different when we're ending a relationship amicably with somebody that we're continuing to care for in one way or another, than when somebody maybe, betrayed our trust, or cheated on us, or you know, uh, did something that is really hard to repair, right? Like that kind of issue will increase the cost of the breakup, of sorts, because there's more emotional um, turmoil that arises in that process, and a lot more likelihood to be more conflict focused, than when there is more care and like communication and less resentment or anger, right? So depending on the conditions of the breakup, the cost is really our mental health and wellness, and also the cost, I would say, also in our community, right? Because when a breakup ends, it's not something that just affects, the people that were part of the relationship, but the children, the families, the extended families, and also the friend groups. Like it really affects a lot of different things. So it also affects our social dynamics. It also affects like how day to day looks like. So it really becomes like an obvious part of like a really big shift in our stability, and the predictability of our day to day. Right. So all of that really shifts that. And as a therapist, therapy is not cheap, right? That's also part of the process. when we're, processing what it's like to experience something. Of course, there's like lower cost options and stuff, but oftentimes we end up seeing our therapist more often, or needing more support, or even like more distractions when things like this happen. And then, it does add up to the cost emotionally, but also financially.
Yeah, like if you have a shopping habit like I do a lot of retail therapy, so it can be quite costly. Which kind of like is what I'm thinking about now, which is that like how does like a heightened like emotional state sort of affect decision making from like a psychological standpoint? Like, could you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. It's really important to think about how our emotions really influence our perceptions or behaviors. And when we're in love, or really really into someone, that can really sometimes influence the decisions that we make. So it can lead to us maybe being overly trusting. It can lead to us not protecting ourselves. It can lead to us not setting boundaries where there should be, because we want to keep this relationship, because our happy chemicals are kind of going wild inside our brains, and we're like so excited about it, right? Similarly, this can also happen when we're transitioning out of a relationship, because we might not feel empowered to be able to transition. We might not feel empowered to be able to ask for what we need, because we're feeling so heartbroken or sad about this ending, right? So our emotions really influence those decision making processes. So it can kind of like inhibit them or enhance them in some way or another.
Hmm. That's interesting. Adriana, have you ever seen this like in your office? Like, like people that are in a more like heightened emotional state and like their decision making has like changed maybe?
Heightened emotional state, really, daily. Honestly, I mean, it's it's really is a really special. It's a privilege to be able to provide this guidance to members who are going through this really turbulent time, because it may be one of the hardest things that they've ever experienced. Um, I think the biggest thing that I've noted is just that um, what's been really striking is that for especially a lot of women who are recently separated or divorced or widowed, they can really sometimes struggle to manage or even understand their finances. And a lot of times they haven't been an active participant, or they haven't been invited to these conversations. And so now they're at this point in their life, which is already extremely distressing and overwhelming, and they are completely anxiety ridden. And now they're having to have these conversations that are quite foreign to them, and they're dealing or having to learn these concepts that can be quite complicated. Um, and so it's really important. That's why I really try and advocate financial literacy, because I haven't seen necessarily some questionable decision making. It's really just more that that emotional state and that overwhelm. And when you're at that point, it's really hard, or it can be really challenging to absorb new information that you need to be taking in at this time. So I would certainly invite, for anyone who is going through this experience and working with experts, to you know make sure that you're comfortable working with these people. And if you find yourself working with an advisor, or a lawyer, and you're not comfortable with them, then that's okay, because this is a really important time in your life, and it's so important for you to be able to feel comfortable so that you can receive this important information.
Yeah, as Adriana was bringing up that example, what was coming up for me too is how sometimes I'm working with folks in the room who are non-binary, or queer, or women, that actually are at times quite knowledgeable around finances and money, and actually have maybe even managed that aspect in their relationship quite a bit. But somehow the ending of the relationship, it leads to this feeling of powerlessness. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like that having that we're talking about buddies, companions, or partners are kind of tethers for us, and they support with like a sense of stability. So this big sense of stability is not shifting with the ending of this partnership as it looked. Even it's hard to trust. Like I see these clients being having a difficult time trusting themselves and their ability to carry on and continue to take care of those very duties that they were taking in their relationship, but just on their own. So it can also be in the flip side of that. So it's really good to really connect with our own knowledge or seek that knowledge like Adriana is naming, and really begin to develop that trust with ourselves that we are going to be able to kind of navigate that with or without that partner.
I love that. Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, we always believe in like knowledge is power here at Bad Academy. So these workshops will always be available to everybody. And I hope like in the future that if you do have a friend or a family member that's going through something, you can refer them to this workshop. Okay, so we're coming up on like pretty quickly on the Q&A section of the workshop here. So if you do have any outstanding questions, go ahead and pop them into the Q&A. I have a quick question because I'm just curious. Maybe Alicia can answer this. What is the difference between a mediator and a lawyer?
That is a good question, because they can be the same person. So basically, if you hire a lawyer, in that traditional sense of that word, then it means that that person is working for you. They have what's called an undivided loyalty to looking out for your best interests and giving you advice based on that. And so as a lawyer, you can, like if I was representing you, I would not be able to be representing your spouse, even though intellectually I can see both sides and I could. The Law Society really covets the relationship that a lawyer has with their client, and that the client feels absolutely supported by the lawyer. And so you just have that singular purpose in your relationship with them. Even if your spouse was paying my bills, I would still have that singular, like maybe devotion is too strong of a word, but this is a singular view of assisting you and looking out for, what I think is your best interest. And we would talk about that. So a mediator, what they're doing is they're not actually providing you with legal advice the way that a lawyer would. So in that example, Amanda, I'm giving you legal advice. I'm explaining the law and like what your best options are in your particular circumstance. As a mediator, you can't do that because essentially both spouses have retained you to help them reach a resolution. And so because you're effectively working for both spouses, you can't give them individual legal advice. So all you're trying to do is maybe give them legal education on what the law is, but not how it specifically applies to them, or not how, their best interest is served by a particular, piece of legislation or a particular outcome. All you're trying to do is say, okay, this is what the law says on child support. This is how it would be calculated. And, based on your incomes, this is what it is, rather than, Amanda, if we kind of changed you had, more expenses running through your company, your income would be less. So then the child support might be like there's no strategy that can go on.
I see. Like, why would someone choose a mediator though, like over a lawyer?
So I always recommend that. I think if you can choose a mediator, that's a great way to go, because you're basically sharing the cost of the mediator versus each of you having your own lawyers. There are mediators who are not lawyers, and then there's mediators who are lawyers. So you can decide, based on the profile of that particular mediator, whether they jive with what you're looking for or not. But you're sharing that cost. So that's one really huge advantage. I would say if you have a very high conflict situation and a significant power imbalance, so you have one person that the spouse has a whole bunch of companies and a very complicated, business portfolio, and then the other spouse has no idea about what the business portfolio is or what it does, you may need a lawyer to help explain what's going on, maybe behind the scenes, or maybe you need your own lawyer just because the mediator can't properly explain that to you. So mediators work best with people that are kind of have a similar level of knowledge, or there's not a significant power imbalance. And it's not high conflict. Like they can, have some, amicable type conversations to work through the issues. Be in a meeting together, and, there's some spouses that, cannot even see their spouse, don't want to have any contact with them at all. So mediation is going to be a lot more difficult. You can go to a mediator also with your own lawyers. There's all the time if we can't reach a negotiated settlement. So, but I think it's a great first option for people. It's way more cost effective than having your own lawyer, and the mediators can draft your final agreement with you. And it's like more collaborative process where you're actually giving your input and talking about things together. There's another process called collaborative divorce. And collaborative divorce, all the lawyers, like mediators, have specific training in interest-based negotiation. And essentially each spouse has their own collaborative lawyer, but you work together, the four of you, to try and reach a resolution that's best for the family. So it's completely out of court. It's non-adversarial. The lawyers still have that client-lawyer relationship where you are giving them that advice sort of behind the scenes, but you're working more together as a team. So from my perspective, collaborative divorce and going to a mediator without lawyers is the most efficient, best way to resolve things if you want to have any kind of friendly relationship down the line.
Right. So like if you were like, say, for example, you're like co-parenting and like
Yeah.
you need to kind of like get along, then yeah, understood.
Least destructive. Like I'm a collaborative lawyer, and all the lawyers that practice in the collaborative style, and I'm a mediator as well. You have to have your mediation training actually to do the collaborative work, but all the lawyers that do the collaborative work, I really respect them. And I think they're really there to try to preserve the family for the purposes of their kids. The family looks different, but we need to preserve it in some way for the kids. I think court is extremely destructive. I know there's a place for it. Sometimes people just, their spouse is really unreasonable, and they have to use that process, and that's why it's there. But if you don't have to use it, don't use it. It's hard for recover from a court process because it's adversarial. There's a winner and a loser. That's how it's designed. It's not like, how do we make the pie bigger? It's how do we just divide the pie?
Right. That's really great advice.
Also a lot more expensive.
Yes, exponentially more expensive. Like talking about cost, a trial can cost, $100,000, $50,000, $100,000, $500,000. The collaborative process, you're probably looking at more like a $10,000 to $20,000 cost for the whole process. If you go to a mediator on your own, you could be looking at $5,000 or less that the two of you share. So, I mean, it is exponentially different depending on the process.
Okay. Wow. Those are real numbers right there.
Yeah. Ones.
Speaking of like numbers when it comes to kind of like mediation and stuff, Louisa, like I'd love to hear your perspective on like couples counseling and kind of what you've noticed like in your practice. Not necessarily from like a cost point of view necessarily, but I just love to hear more about like your observations when it comes to like resolving some of these conflicts between couples, and what your obviously your bias, but like the benefits, and maybe some dispelling some of the sort of like hangups that people have about it.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Yeah, so I know, again, this might sound like I'm biased, but I really think that it's really important to seek support in having these conversations if you feel that you need it. Sometimes that support can be a counselor. Sometimes it doesn't have to be a counselor. Sometimes even just like, a trusted friend, a family member can be a part of that process if you want them to be. But I feel like sometimes folks really think that relationship counseling is like a place where you go when there's a problem. And it is utilized like that a lot. But then when we end up seeing is that the relationship counseling space becomes more of like a the beginning of the separation process rather than a preventative process. I think that is best used if you're noticing, okay, we're having, difficulties in communication, and we just want some support in, attending to those negative relationship cycles that we're noticing, or we're not able to stop fighting in this particular way, but everything else is really good and steady. I suggest that is when we should be trying to access that couples counseling or relationship counseling space, because that's where we can really tackle those things before those things start to fester and the resentment starts to develop, or the dynamic becomes so stuck that it feels like ending the relationship is better than actually working on it. Right? In relationship counseling, the relationship is actually the client, it's not the individual relationship, folks. So it's really about the sustainability and the success of the relationship, and having that party can really support that process, because it becomes like a collaborative, gentle space to really look at each individual partner's participation in the dynamic. So I would say, don't go to relationship counseling only when you're having this really big problem that you cannot address. It's actually way better to go earlier in a preventative way, because it really develops those positive ways of communication and the strategies that work better for everybody.
Well said. Okay, so we're gonna open up the Q&A questions now. This is for everybody, so feel free to weigh in when you feel like you're ready. What are some financial red flags? That's a very broad question, but I guess like in general, like if what pops into your minds as our panelists.
Um, I'll go first. For me, what comes up as a financial red flag is somebody who refuses to discuss finances at any given moment in time, and or somebody who is deflecting that conversation as something that is not important. I think that is really important, because it, as much as I'm not like somebody who loves money, like I said earlier, money does give you access to things. It is a source of stability, and it can be a source of trauma. So I think it's really important to learn about those habits, talk about them, even learning how to be uncomfortable together. So when people are not doing those conversations, it is a little bit of a red flag for me. And the defensiveness around looking at ourselves, surrounding our own relationship with money, would also be a little bit of a red flag.
Yeah, I echo that wholeheartedly. I feel like forthcomingness and is really key, and being able to have those open conversations. And if someone's not going to be forthcoming, or if they're being defensive, then that's a red flag. I would also be cautious if, when you are having these conversations, that you are noticing that you're not on the same page. If your goals are not aligned, um, that to me would indicate potential incompatibility over the long term. And just, if you are observing spending habits, and you might be having conversations, but they're not changing over time, I would consider that. um, I think overall, actions speak louder than words. And people will generally, they'll show you who they are. So I would just be very mindful of how people are behaving in terms of their spending habits, and are they aligned with what they're saying.
Anything to add to that, Leisha?
I don't think so. I mean, the only thing I was thinking about is if someone is using money as a form of control, like financial control has been considered part of the definition of family violence for us. So often people will withhold money or have conditions on spending money. So if you're noticing that you're not having these open conversations, or money is being withheld, or like being really overly monitored, in a way that's very controlling, then look out for that, because family violence is not just physical violence. It takes many forms, and that's considered one of them.
That's a really good piece of information. Thank you, Leisha. Okay, so we got some like more like specific questions. My partner and I both contribute to a bank account, and each of our FHSA accounts. We split the contributions equally based on our income. To protect the investment made, would a notarized agreement hold up if we were to break up, or is a cohabitation agreement better?
Sorry, what was the HSA account? I didn't know what that was. So they're contributing to a joint account.
Sorry, Adrian. No.
So that the FHSA, that is the most recent registered account that's been opened up for Canadians. So it's first home savings account.
Okay.
It's like an RSP, TFSA kind of thing.
Okay. And they're both contributing to it. And the question is, if they separate, can they get their money back that they contributed?
It's like it says, would a notarized agreement hold up if we were to break up, or is a cohabitation agreement better?
Well, basically any agreement will hold up, even to some extent. I mean, basically, even if you draft something and you both sign it and have it witnessed by someone over the age of 19 who's not a family member, the reason for the witness is just to say that when they sign the agreement, the other person didn't like have a gun to their head or something. The witness is there just to make sure that when they signed, they were, generally of sound mind and not under any duress at the time. If they sign off on it, it is a binding agreement that can be upheld. So you don't need anything super fancy. That would be kind of like the bronze standard. The gold standard would be like a full cohabitation agreement drafted by a lawyer where you have independent legal advice.
Okay. So I'm going to do these more rapid fire, guys. Dave Ramsey, I don't know if everyone knows who this is, but he's a popular financial advisor. I don't always agree with what this man says. Is dead set on couples combining accounts, saying couples should combine their accounts and look at their money as a whole. Do you believe that is always best? I'm going to say this first before everyone weighs in, which is that there's never one answer for everybody. Everybody is different. So it's really dependent on what your goals are as a person. So maybe Adriana can weigh in on that.
So I'm just where is this question?
Oh, it's in the Q&A, but basically Dave Ramsey says that you should always combine your finances so you can look at your money as a whole, as a couple. And they're asking if you believe that this is always best.
No, I do not. Saying things like always, speaking in absolutes, I really just can't subscribe to that, because no one situation is ever the same. Sure, there can be advantages that we kind of touched on earlier, but really making sure that it's making the most sense for your situation, and that you're comfortable, you understand the agreement, and it's suitable for you. So no, I would say that it's not always best.
Right. Here's a question. I find this one really interesting. So this is in relation to the marriage-like legalities. We've heard of the stories of a shared bank accounts between friends to generate wealth like a couple without getting locked into a common law. So apparently Ben Affleck and Matt Damon do this. I'm wondering if panelists could speak to other examples of how those of us, queer, childless, etc., that will never benefit from marriage or marriage-like systems, can still use them to our advantage.
Adriana, I'm trying to think of.
I mean, I think that whenever you are combining assets, it's it's not something to be taken lightheartedly. You do need to it's quite serious, as Leisha has touched on. There are a lot of legal ramifications, and you can be exposed to debt. So making sure that if you are combining your finances, if it's a business venture, that it's done in that you really are very clear on what you're getting in on, and seeking legal advice for that partnership and that combining of assets.
Okay, I've had some time to think on that while Adriana was talking. So, I mean, even if you're not in a marriage-like relationship, it's pretty easy to be found to be in a partnership, like a business partnership. There doesn't need to be anything legally saying you're in a business partnership. It's kind of like a marriage-like relationship. It can be found based on the facts that you're in a partnership. And you can be found like liable for debts in a partnership if one partner incurs the debt. So I think that there's the same benefits of combining finances in a marriage-like relationship to like have more equity to maybe, buy a property or to invest, or, combining your finances to do something greater than you could do on your own. There's advantages to that, and I don't think you need to be married to or marriage-like relationship to do that, but you have to understand that there's downsides and still a huge amount of trust. Lots of business partnerships blow up and are very messy. They're just like divorces. So I think you need to go in with a partnership agreement or some understanding of what you're getting yourself involved in.
I mean, like, Louisa, I'm gonna let you speak as well on this. I just wanted to share the story that I just got back from Taiwan visiting my family, and my mom was telling me that in her community back when she was a kid, they used to do this thing where they would like pool money from the community. So it'd be like a group of people, like 10 families, and then every month everybody would contribute like a pot of like a little bit of money. And then this would just like live in, like whatever, not necessarily a bank account, but everyone just had this pot of money. And then if someone had an emergency, like something happened to someone's car or someone had to go through a medical procedure, they would use that money to support the person in the community. And then that person would pay it back eventually through this system. And I guess like, I mean, you could call that mutual aid essentially. But I'm saying that like, although there are some benefits to, being in a partnership or being in a marriage like relationship when it comes to legal stuff or financial stuff, I think there's also a lot of benefit of just being your own independent person and having that control over your finances, and then also having a community that might have like, the same values as you do when it comes to supporting each other through finance. Maybe Louisa can speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, that's a really great practice that you shared, Amanda. I feel like we see this a lot in like queer communities with like different kind of like family structures, just figuring out, how we can support one another, especially when we have different access to finances, different levels of privilege in education, like all of those different factors affect folks' like ability to earn, right? So I think it's really, really wonderful to explore what is the trust between me and the folks that I want to engage in this project with? Like, do we have that shared vision? What is that shared vision? Like, how are we all going to maybe equitably contribute to that? Because it doesn't have to be equal, right? If we have different earning power, if we have different levels of privilege, if we have different levels of education or different identities, different social locations, such as like race, class, gender, all of those different factors are going to influence how each person contributes, right? But I agree with Leisha there. I feel like it would be really wonderful to really get really detailed in that and what that collaboration is going to look like. What are we working towards? What are the risks? What will happen if this doesn't work out, if somebody wants to pull out? Being able to decide that early on collectively and having some sort of agreement seems to be the best way to navigate that. But it's just like about community building.
Yeah, I like community-based stuff. It's kind of my deal, so I get it. Okay, so we're running a little bit short on time, so I'm just gonna kind of go through these quickly. When you talk about the importance of having aligned financial goals, what is a financial goal? Could you give examples? Adriana?
Yeah, good question. So financial goals can include things like I want to purchase a home within 5 to 10 years. I want to retire by age 65. I want to have X amount of income when I retire. Those are, when we have really tangible um, goals that we can that are they've got a specific time frame, they've got a specific number attached to them, then we can kind of reverse engineer and figure out, okay, how much money do we need, how much time do we need, how are we going to get there. And so if you are in a relationship with someone and you have goals X, Y, and Z, and maybe they don't have any, or they're very different, then that will also be a good indication if this is a compatible relationship, if we're on the same page.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, here's a very specific one. How long after a breakup do you have to sort out property division? My ex and I sorted out a DIY spousal support lump sum payment when we initially broke up 7 months ago, but it still doesn't sit right with the property division aspect. The lawyer I consulted at the time said it probably wasn't worth it. Maybe Alicia can weigh in on this one.
Yeah, so basically, if you are not married, and you're common law, like just living together, from the date you separate, you have 2 years to bring any claim in the courts. And if you don't do that, then your limitation period has run out to bring those claims after the 2 years. So you cannot bring them after the 2 years. So if you're common law, that's really important because that can go by quite quickly, and you don't want to accidentally let your ability to bring a claim go by. If you're married, your limitation period, so the 2 years, does not start to run until you're divorced. So your limitation period really can go, like, really doesn't start until divorce. And usually, you actively have to go through a court process to get a divorce. So there's a lot more leeway if you're married. There's certain exceptions that can pause the limitation period. Like if you're actively engaged in a mediation process or a collaborative process, it pauses that limitation period. But you should consult a lawyer basically if you've properly paused your limitation period. And yeah, so I think that's the main thing to focus on is, are you getting close to that 2 year mark if you're not married? And what you can do is you can actually just file a claim with the court, and that protects your limitation period. And you don't necessarily have to serve the person or like give the claim to the person right away, but at least you've protected your rights if you guys are still talking and you don't want to like drop a bomb on them in the middle of like what are otherwise pretty good conversations.
All right. Thank you, Alicia. Okay, our last question, and I know we have another one, but we are out of time. What are some more subtle ways that people can exert financial control that are so yeah, more subtle ways that they can exert financial control, because the ones that we talked about were like a pretty intense. So I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about that. It might be like, I'm trying to think, just like maybe more being like very, very distrustful of your partner and their spending potentially. Like it might be like exerting more control, basically trying to have more control over another person's spending habits.
I can speak to that. I would say that like the subtle cues of that might be kind of like diminishing or putting down a partner and their relationship with the money. So
Mhm.
it starts subtly. It starts with like, oh, you don't know what you're doing. Like, oh, you don't know how you're spending. Oh, whatever, until that person can slowly maybe create a sense of distrust or doubt within the other partner. And that leads to the other partner maybe leaning on that partner more and more and more for those financial decisions or the financial control aspects of the relationship. So it gets more and more overt when then it becomes about restricting. It becomes about I get to determine how much money you actually get. You don't have access to our accounts. I kind of like keep certain information away from you. That's when it becomes way more overt, the level of control that somebody has. But it starts with very subtly kind of putting someone down, and slowly taking control of specific aspects of that decision-making process.
That makes a lot of sense.
I would just quickly add to that, and I think that's a really good point, Louisa. And I think also if you're not the person making the money, often I hear like, oh, you're not making the money, so you don't get to decide. You're just at home, like really devaluing their role as a whole in the family unit. But then equating it with you're not valuable because you're not bringing in money.
Yeah, really good point, Leisha.
Thank you for naming that. Yeah, the devaluing is a key piece because it adds to that self-doubt. It adds to that I don't get to have an opinion on this.
Thank you so much, everybody. We are at the end of this panel. That was awesome. That was so much good information. Um, we really hope that you got something out of this, even if it's just more information or kind of sparks like a thought in your head that you didn't have before. If you want to learn more about some of the things that we talked about, I'll send you the resource list after, likely tomorrow with the recording. And all these wonderful women are available. Just if your question didn't get answered, just email me at Bad Academy, and I'll see if I can get those questions in front of them. But I'll send all of the information of how to get in touch with them if you're interested in talking to them more. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists for being here and bringing your amazing knowledge to this subject. And everybody stay safe and feel empowered to do what you want to do. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. Thanks, Amanda and my other panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Thank you.